Long, gnarled claws curl around the leg of the wounded villager, dragging them through the snow like a rag doll. Darkness is falling. The air is freezing. And yet, the poor doomed soul being pulled towards a horrific fate by the ancient hunched figure is smiling blissfully. In the forest, every sound, no matter how small, puts you on edge. The snap of a twig underfoot, the rustle of leaves overhead, the wind passing between the trees, all conjures up images of something else out there, watching, following, hunting you. The backpacker takes another cursory glance over his shoulder, the nagging thought that maybe he should turn back and retrace his steps to the main road, poking at his brain. It's not too late, the tiny voice tells him. You can make it back before dark. Someone is bound to come along who can help. He looks back to his map, squinting in the fleeting sunlight. There's a town nearby, a small place just off the beaten track. Cutting through the woods is the quickest way to get there, and he can't help but invite the possibility that he's only a few feet away from the furthest edge of the tree line. Just a little bit further can't hurt. And if he doesn't make it to the town by the time the sun fully sets, then he can turn back before it's too late. He should have turned back sooner. We'll return to our backpacker in just a moment. But first, I have a question directly for you. Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Regardless if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or if you're just a human who lives in this world who is going through a hard time, therapy can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, and this is an important mission because finding a therapist can be really hard, especially when you're limited to the options in your area. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you to a professional therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/DrBob. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with the therapist and see if it helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing with therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost, without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/DrBob. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. And now, back to our backpacker. The backpacker has been crossing Eastern Europe for the past few months, traveling mostly on foot up until now. But walking through the freezing, rural areas of southern Russia was a quick way to get pneumonia, so he'd been opting to hitchhike until he made his way to a warmer part of the country. Most people were wary of picking him up and helping him get from one point to the next. The few that weren't, thankfully, spoke enough English to make communication possible. Thanks to his persistence and broken Russian, the backpacker had made it a decent distance. That is, until the most recent ride he'd hitched. He wasn't sure why, or even really what had happened. The driver who'd picked him up alongside the highway had seemed amicable enough, right up until he'd taken an unexpected detour. The backpacker had been keeping a close eye on his map and noticed the driver turn off at a different exit, pulling up alongside the forest on a long, empty stretch of highway. Suddenly, the driver started aggressively yelling at him, urging him to leave the vehicle immediately. The backpacker had thought maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding and could barely keep up with the thick Russian being hurled at him. But then, the driver sped away, laughing loudly with his windows down. He yelled something back at the backpacker, but only one phrase stood out to him as the car receded into the distance. Baba Yaga. Now, lost in the woods, the sun rapidly disappearing, the backpacker tries desperately to keep hold of his bearings. That town is close, only a few feet away. It has to be, he tells himself. Too close to justify turning back and trying to hail another passing car. He produces a pocket flashlight, its dim beam betraying just how small its remaining battery life is. The low light creates a few tiny glimmers in the snow, but they do little to dull the sense of worry that's rising higher and higher in the backpacker. A twig snaps, too far away for it to have been caused by his own footstep. The backpacker's heart jumps in his chest, and he turns to point his flashlight in the direction of the sound. His trembling, freezing fingers cause the light to shudder as it falls over a figure, standing in a clearing not far from him. They're hunched over, the kind of posture that typically comes with old age, dragging a person's upper body closer and closer to the ground. But he can't get a clear look at them. Their back is turned. The backpacker calls out, trying to recall some of his guidebook's typical Russian greetings to get the person's attention. The figure turns and speaks, saying something in a low, raspy voice. It sounds close to the Russian language, but a dialect that's far too old for a novice like the backpacker to recognize, let alone understand. He cautiously steps closer, the flashlight revealing the figure is an elderly woman. What's she doing out here in the forest, all alone at night? The backpacker tries to ask for directions, mentioning the name of the small town he saw nearby on the map, just the other side of the forest. And then he sees her, the old woman, illuminated under the flickering light. Her skin is wrinkled, covered in pockmarks and deep lines, and her beady black eyes stare out at him. Saliva drips from her mouth, dribbling down her chin. Each finger is tipped with a rotting, overgrown yellow nail, protruding out of her bony fingers like talons. And the entire time he looks at her, the backpacker can think only one thing. One phrase that the driver who intentionally abandoned him here said, and why it had sounded so familiar. Baba Yaga, a creature from local folklore who dwelled in the forests and lured people to their deaths, one that typically took the form of a decrepit old woman. As the flashlight in his frozen hand blinks off, the backpacker turns heel and dashes through the trees. The rational part of his brain has been drowned out by the screaming, terrified panic. He throws off his heavy backpack, not daring to so much as peek over his shoulder for fear of seeing the face of the old woman in his peripheral vision, her claw-like hands reaching for him to tear him to shreds. Freed from his own cumbersome belongings, he rushes back through the forest, hoping he is going the same way he came. Something lightly brushes at his skin, causing him to scream and splutter, swiping his hands to try and swat it away. Light, thin cobwebs cling to him as the backpacker tries to clear them from his arms, face, and hair. Then, suddenly, he feels calm again. Better than calm. He feels good, as if he wasn't just fleeing for his life. The dark of the forest around him seems to brighten, and he lies down on the snow-covered ground with a relaxed sigh. He doesn't even notice the old woman slowly shuffling towards him, or feel her teeth sinking into his flesh. A report of a missing hitchhiker was filed after a man was caught bragging in a bar about ditching someone on the side of the road. Local authorities questioned the driver and asked him why he'd left an innocent backpacker to potentially die in the freezing forest. The driver simply chuckled and sneered in Russian. The Baba Yaga needs to eat. Humanoid SCPs can often be some of the most unsettling of all the anomalies that the Foundation can encounter. Sure, the sight of a creature like SCP-682 or SCP-096 is often terrifying in both their ferocity and the danger they present. But there's something about a being that looks almost human, but isn't, that can be particularly unnerving. It's the sense of familiarity, the appearance of another person that causes us to subconsciously lower our guard and relax, only to be rewarded for being so trusting with a swift and brutal death. Such is the case with SCP-352, often referred to by the name it is given in Slavic folklore, Baba Yaga. Now, while you might be forgiven for believing that this name refers to the boogeyman, or synonymous with a hitman known for being the person to call if you wanted to kill said boogeyman, the reality is a little different. According to tales from Eastern Europe that date back centuries, the Baba Yaga is a creature that dwells deep in the heart of the forest, bearing the appearance of an old woman, often described as appearing particularly grotesque. The Baba Yaga of legend differs from our notion of what we might call the boogeyman, existing solely to cause some form of supernatural torment to others. Instead, Baba Yaga is more often considered to be a more ambiguous figure, who will either hinder or provide aid to any who encounter her, should they seek her out in the forests. Some stories have even portrayed her as a sympathetic, maternal creature, responsible for the protection of wildlife. The point being, Baba Yaga is far more of a mysterious and multifaceted being than you may think, at least according to the stories. Much like the legends often suggest, SCP-352 also appears to be an old, emaciated woman. So old, in fact, that it's hard to determine her exact age. Little is known about her exact origins. However, what has been documented by the SCP Foundation is her speech patterns. SCP-352 exclusively speaks in a dialect reminiscent of Old Russian, the medieval precursor to the modern Russian language. Despite this, however, her thick accent and regional dialect have made it nearly impossible to translate anything she says, even by the Foundation's most accomplished linguistic experts. What also doesn't help is just how little SCP-352 is willing to communicate. The few times she has, and from what sparse patterns of her speech are decipherable, SCP-352 offers little information and instead only gives out threats and vows of one day having her revenge. Given how highly aggressive in nature she is, SCP-352 has never given the Foundation her name or revealed if she even has one. Next to no background information has been uncovered about her, either through attempting to converse with SCP-352 directly or by conducting research into her past. Now, a hostile and uncooperative elderly woman who doesn't like to communicate outside of threats might not seem all that unsettling, unless you've worked in retail, but it's true that from the outside, there doesn't appear to be anything all that anomalous or even unsettling about SCP-352. At first, at least. But the notion of her being a harmless old lady fades away in an instant as soon as you get a glimpse of the monster within. Looks, after all, can be deceiving, and with SCP-352, deception seems to be the intention. Foundation researchers have discovered that this anomaly, whilst seeming like a frail old lady, actually possesses a level of strength far beyond that typical of an ordinary human at her apparent age. The same can also be said of her speed, given she is far faster than should be possible, especially given her apparently weaker stature. Yet, despite the assumptions that can be made from her external attributes, SCP-352 has been known to move masses in excess of 200 kilos with little difficulty, as well as moving at speeds of around 70 kilometers per hour. Those feats would be considered superhuman for an elite athlete, let alone a seemingly decrepit old woman. But then again, even the most accomplished and athletic person can't regenerate wounds. SCP-352, on the other hand, has been observed to have the ability of rapid cellular repair, healing from injuries that would be otherwise fatal to an ordinary person. This includes even extreme instances of bodily damage. While the reconstruction of her body can take anywhere between a few days to several weeks, and perhaps isn't as fast as some other entities, it does mean that little can be done to permanently destroy SCP-352. However, curiously, according to analysis by research teams, she still appears to be human, at least internally. She possesses muscles, bones, and internal organs that are all in a state of advanced aging, seemingly consistent with her external elderly appearance, in a way that her anomalous speed, strength, and bodily regeneration aren't. But these factors alone certainly seem like tenuous reasons to nickname SCP-352 after the infamous Baba Yaga of Eastern European folklore. There must be a more cogent explanation as to why some among the Foundation are scared to even go near her, believing her to really be the terrifying, decrepit, forest-dwelling figure of legend. And it's true, there's certainly more to this anomaly than some enhanced abilities and apparent immortality. For one, SCP-352 possesses the ability to grow thin strands of a hair-like substance from any part of her body, and can seemingly do so at will. This thin biological thread of sorts can grow to be several meters in length within the span of only an hour. What's more, SCP-352 can also directly control these threads. While she has been in containment at the Foundation, staff are not permitted to interact with SCP-352 directly. However, during observation by personnel, these threads that grow from her body have been seen crawling up walls and across the floor of her containment chamber. An individual one of these threads is thinner and weaker than the consistency and tensile strength of ordinary human hair, although they are also clear, making them almost invisible to the naked eye, unless enough of a mass of them is present. Further analysis of these strands reveals that they're coated in a layer of enzyme that is unique to SCP-352. Although present in all of her bodily tissue, this enzyme that SCP-352 produces is at its highest level of concentration within the anomaly's saliva and hair. Chemical analysis conducted by Foundation researchers has still failed to determine the exact makeup of the enzyme itself. However, the side effects of it coming into contact with humans are very well documented. Should SCP-352's enzyme reach human tissue, it will begin to rapidly attack the nervous system, with symptoms that manifest in a number of unsettling and degenerative ways. Almost immediately, a person who so much as gets some of this enzyme on their skin will start to experience vivid hallucinations and will often have the logical part of their brain shut down, diminishing their cognitive ability and preventing them from thinking or acting rationally. The subject's pain receptors are also suppressed, meaning any serious injury will be unfelt and could potentially be life-threatening if left untreated. They will remain in this hallucinatory state for several days, depending on the level of exposure to the enzyme they've experienced. But the higher the dosage carries the greater likelihood of this manic state becoming permanent. One bite from SCP-352 is enough to achieve this result, driving its victims into a delirium where they can trust neither the things their eyes are seeing or the thoughts in their own brain. According to research conducted by the Foundation into SCP-352's habits, the creature sustains itself on a carnivorous diet, its main and preferred source of food being human flesh. And slowly you're probably starting to put these different aspects of SCP-352 together into one gruesome picture. Like several strands spun together into a particularly unsettling web, almost exactly like the kind that SCP-352 weaves to catch its prey. Much like a spider, SCP-352 uses the threads produced by her body to create a web of hair, waiting for her prey to stumble into it. By exposing them to the enzyme in her saliva, she can cause them to rapidly become docile, aided particularly by the enzyme's hallucinogenic and pain-numbing properties. Once they've been bitten or otherwise suffered exposure to the enzyme, SCP-352 will trap her victim and begin to devour them. As has been observed by Foundation personnel both during testings and during SCP-352's discovery, she doesn't like her prey running away. As such, the anomalous old woman will often begin by completely disabling and incapacitating them. She then spends the following few days gradually eating her human prey until there is nothing left of them. Despite the horrific, stomach-churning images of SCP-352 eating someone being positively traumatizing to anyone unlucky enough to witness it, the victims themselves are often docile throughout the grisly process. Thanks to the enzyme in their systems, these unfortunate persons are often numb to the painful sensations and often experience an elevated rush of dopamine instead of the intense fear you might expect from a person being devoured by a decrepit old lady. Most of SCP-352's victims display a lack of awareness of their surroundings, with no knowledge of the outside world, as they suffer their own ingestion and eventual demise. Before the Foundation had a chance to observe all of this firsthand, reports of an enchanted forest were responsible for drawing their attention to a small township in southern Russia. According to the local stories circulating at the time, a witch had been responsible for the deaths of several people nearby. But it wasn't until word of this supposed witch's capture reached them that the Foundation decided to take a closer look and send in a team to investigate. A recovery team arrived in southern Russia, expecting to find the captured anomaly and some townspeople up in arms at the perpetrator of the recent deaths. Instead, they arrived to discover the area was deserted, not a living soul in sight. As they fanned out to explore the area, the first of the unsettling discoveries soon presented itself. A number of dead bodies in various states of decay. The smell was unbearable, but what was worse was there was no sign of the so-called witch. They soon happened across a clue as to where she might be, though. There was a trail of blood in the snow, leading from the town towards the forest at its outskirts. The shape and direction of the blood seemed to indicate that the bodies were dragged in the direction of the forest, the same place the locals had reported was enchanted. Venturing away from the small, frost-bitten town, the Foundation recovery team were surrounded on all sides by dense trees, dustings of ice over their crystallized leaves and branches. They searched the area, each footstep embedded in the snow with a crunch. Following the blood trail, one of the group, further away from the others, swore he felt something brush against his skin. He waved it away. It was just a cobweb. Or rather, it was just like a cobweb. Before long, the main group had lost contact with him and huddled together while sending out one of their number to retrieve their missing fellow agent. The Foundation operative traversed the forest until the sounds of snarling and crunching caught his attention. It was not the soft sound of snow underfoot. This was the brittle gnawing and snapping of bone against teeth. He peered out from behind a tree, and through a net of almost invisible threads hanging between them was an elderly figure crouched over the missing agent, devouring him alive. The operative muttered under his breath, the words exiting in a plume of warm fog in front of his face. Baba Yaga. A number of additional recovery teams were soon sent in by the Foundation to retrieve the anomaly. Thanks to multiple cases of exposure to the enzyme, heavy casualties were incurred before SCP-352 was eventually captured and brought back to the Foundation. Recovery teams also discovered a large quantity of the hair-like threads, enough to form a web that covered most of the forest. It quickly became apparent that this was responsible for the incidents of Foundation agents falling prey to SCP-352, with most writing off any contact with the threads as either the feeling of their own hair or spiderwebs against their skin. As of now, the anomaly designated as SCP-352 is kept in a sealed containment area at all times. Direct interaction with her is strictly prohibited unless carried out via remote means, such as through security cameras. If human personnel are required to interact with SCP-352 under any extenuating circumstances, then full hazmat protocol is to be observed at all times. Anyone exhibiting erratic behavior or showing any indications of hallucinations must be placed in immediate quarantine and tested for enzyme contamination. If any personnel are bitten by SCP-352, they are to be abandoned. SCP-352 is fed once a week. A more efficient food source, employing the use of SCP-604 or SCP-1680, is still being reviewed and pending approval from the site director. In the meantime, the Baba Yaga still needs to eat, and there's only one thing that she's shown a preference for. Check out the DrBob Patreon and become a junior researcher today. Now go and watch another entry from the files of DrBob, like SCP-150, Body Stealing Parasite, Ship of Theseus.